Ice Age.
So Kizaru versus Luffy, perhaps the most divisive fight in One Piece history. You got one half of the fan base, probably more so 75 to 80% of the fan base that think Luffy fighterized Kizaru, that just destroyed him, that Kizaru looks like a bum. You got the other 20% that believes that Kizaru is still stronger, that believes that Kizaru mentally conflicted, etc., etc. And I think that it's super clear what the answer is to this. I think that there's some people with genuine confusion. I also think that there's some people that just don't give a shit and they just have a belief one way for their agenda, and it's not going to change no matter what evidence is presented. Whichever shoe fits, the shoe fits. But I'm going to do the best of my abilities to give you guys the full analysis for this fight, feats, narrative, portrayal, all the moments, and we're breaking it down. So the first thing that needs to be addressed is when we first start out here, people are pushing a narrative that Luffy is already tired and fatigued going into the fight. This is obviously because he had fought Rob Lucci and he fought the Seraphims, right? Now the problem with this is that a day and night has actually passed. You actually see that in chapter 1078, they give you a breakdown of all the things that have happened, and we see like the concluding moments, the last moments of the Seraphim fight that we get to see on screen. And then we cut away to the world government's plan, talking about how the government had this plan for months and they were sending Kizaru as protection for the Gorosei because Saturn wanted to go personally. All this, and then the unexpected variable of Luffy being there. And then they were talking about how the resolution of this incident took place the following day. So there's the day that the Straw Hats arrive, and that's when he fights Rob Lucci, that's when he fights the Seraphim. And then there's a day that passes, day and night that passes, and that's when Kizaru, Saturn, all these people arrive, and that's when the fights take place. So now within this resolution, you still have people believing that, oh, well, the Straw Hats were fighting all night. For one, it's very clear when you go to 1089 and 1090 that the Straw Hats have been done with their fight for a while. There's been full course meals issued out to even the prisoners down below. People have been patched up already. They're healing. Robin's referencing this. I'm not sure if Sanji was actually cooking, but he's moving around food because they had the food machine there. But it's clear that the fights have been settled for a while. And Luffy even references this talking to Bonnie when he's like, you were crying all night about the Vegapunk situation. So if Luffy was in combat the old time, I don't think he's going to be worried or watching what Bonnie's doing. And regardless, you have a situation where it's unspecified, but to just assume that they fought the entire night is just baseless when the fight that's taking place, they talk about that was the day ago, and everything we cut back and everything's resolute and Luffy's feasting. And it's not just like him eating one singular ham. He literally is feasting. There's a picture just like the ones that were in Wano of him feasting on a full course meal. It's the same food machine that he had when he got back up later, and we're going to get into that moment later. So he's essentially, just like he says when he gets back up later, you know, the White Star Gun and all this stuff, he's at full power when he eats this food. He slams food, got to sit there for all night, eat as much food as he wants. And just to put the scope of this, Luffy's not one to share food when he needs to eat. He's greedy with his food, man. So you looking at this amount of food given to the prisoners down below, and you see the pile of food in front of Luffy is fattened up. You know that man was fully fed. So he was fully fed, revitalized, not to mention he's in awakened zone, so he recovers at a faster rate, and they have a stamina replenishment factor to him. Now people bring up like, oh, Kaku is still fucked up. And yeah, Lucci and Zoro are still hurt too. And like everybody's kind of hurt because they're going to sustain their damage. Luffy works a little bit differently from basic awakened zones. Even though all awakened zones have that recovery factor, Luffy is confirmed to get his strength back from eating, which may tie into his imaginative powers, that he believes that because of, you know, Nika and all this. We don't really know. Regardless, Lucci and Zoro were still capable of fighting. The reason Kaku's in worse shape is simply because he was the weakest of the four of them fighting, and he took the most damage. I think that's obvious and clear. So, of course, no matter what his recovery rate is, if you take a significant amount of damage to where he got incapacitated in the fight and defeated, he's still going to take way longer to recover. And they even reference the fact that, like, when Sanji goes to put the bubble gun on Kaku, they think that he could potentially get back up and maybe even fight. That's why they put him in the bubble gun. Otherwise, they just leave him there. It's a precautionary measure, right? When we cut to the actual fight, 1091 is where we start. But 1090, we see that Luffy had recognized a very strong presence, and you see that it's obviously Kizaru with the light beams coming up. Somebody mentions light right in the panel next to him. And Luffy, after hearing this and after noticing that Kizaru is there, he starts smashing extra food on the ship. So he is even worried about it, clear from his face, and then starts smashing extra food just to make sure he has enough power to fight with Kizaru. So this notion that he was tired and he's not 100% from a stamina perspective is just not true. And I want to make that very, very clear. So then he goes into this fight. Kizaru had just taken out Sentomaru, another, emotional moment. You get highlights of him, having the checklist and wanting to take his friends off the list, but he's going forward with the plan. He gave Sentomaru his one-on-one. He comes up. Luffy goes right after him with the kick. You then have the statement, "We're 100 times stronger than we used to be," which is a direct callback to the Shaki line in Saboti, which, could actually be some Rayleigh hype because it's a direct callback from Oda. With that said, he kicks him and we go off screen. And then we cut back in chapter 1092. And in chapter 1092, Luffy has already kicked in a Snake Man. So base obviously wasn't enough. Gear 2 and 3 weren't enough. He goes into Snake Man. So when he's in Snake Man, what we see is that Kizaru is able to easily react and block all of Luffy's attacks in this form. He just keeps putting his hands up, blocking these attacks. He says, I can see why you're the man that defeated Kaido. So my personal opinion is that Luffy is still weaker than Kaido. I have a whole video explaining this because of the context involved in that fight. So my interpretation is that Kizaru gives Luffy credit he doesn't even truly deserve. Yes, he defeated Kaido, but it's like giving him credit for he's legitimately stronger than Kaido. He beat him in a straight fair and square 1v1, etc. So Kizaru, even with that notion, is saying okay, this guy beat Kaido. He doesn't know the context, and yet it's still not a big issue for him, right? So it's pretty interesting dialogue. It says very powerful stuff, and then they get into the conversation about Vegapunk and why Kizaru is going to kill Vegapunk as Luffy continues to keep attacking him. At this point, Kizaru, while answering this question, completely disappears from Luffy's field of view when Luffy's trying to attack him and literally just sees Ghost missing the punch entirely, and then Kizaru darts off into the distance. Luffy then sees the light glint, understands the direction in which he went, says, "Damn, how far did he fly?" is actively seeking out where Kizaru is, and Kizaru comes back down, acceleration is power, and violently blitzes the shit out of Luffy. And anybody that wants to say Luffy's blinded in this instance, observation haki goes far beyond the sight. It goes far beyond the sight. It is all 5 senses, and he knows the general direction in which he's coming, and the 3 exclamation points really reinforce that he's sensing this being coming after him, and yet he cannot dodge, cannot react to this attack. This is a clear-cut, disgusting blitz. So when he blitzes the shit out of Luffy, Kizaru kicks him through this Vega Force 01. The robot explodes. Luffy is uncontrolled going through this, goes through the barrier, and you see that Kizaru again remembers his time with Vegapunk when Vegapunk created the giant robot, and Luffy is gone. Now at this point, a reoccurring theme you're going to see is that if Kizaru had any intent to fully kill Luffy at any point, which he never even had the intent to fight Luffy, there's multiple instances in which he could put in a lot more effort to do so. When he kicks him this hard, kicks him through the barrier, and Luffy's basically just in free fall, he could chase him out of the barrier. He could chase after him with the kick and just go after him with his sword if he wanted to, chase him when he lands because he's taking a crazy amount of damage. He's reeling, he's rocked. Essentially, he doesn't even think about Luffy and just continues walking on over. So then he goes to Bonnie. He runs into Bonnie, and again, another person he has deep ties to from his 6 months spent on Vegapunk's island. He gives her the love tap kick, which is highlighted with the tap, and says, "I'd rather not hurt any acquaintances." Now, he does kick her through the barrier, which she ends up working out for scaling purposes because she goes through the same barrier Luffy went through at 100%, which really kind of dispels a notion that comes later on. So he kicks her through this barrier. He didn't want to do it. And he even says, look how big she is now. Kids grow these days so fast, because obviously he'd seen her as a kid. So then he goes past Frankie, and then here's the first instance in which he could have killed Vegapunk. So he stands in front of Vegapunk and he says, "Your escape plan is a failure, Vegapunk." Instead of coming in here with this dialogue, he just walks in casually. He could have just bull rushed through to Vegapunk right then and there. Instead, he sits here and has a full-on conversation. Luffy comes back up from the barrier and grabs Kizaru off guard, the first of many off guards you're going to see. So Luffy comes back, and this is the point of hot debate. "Thanks for kicking me all the way down there, jerk. Almost thought I was gonna die, going through that barrier twice." So a lot of people try to bring up oh, it wasn't Kizaru's kick, which is so disingenuous because the whole point of the kick, the explosion, and then going through the barriers, that it's the totality of the situation that fucked Luffy up. Regardless, even if you want to say it was simply the barrier that damaged Luffy, the barrier is literally just a laser cage made of light that shoots a laser just the same way Kizaru can, and Kizaru arguably would just scale over the laser cage anyway, given that he can control his output and it has no effect on him whatsoever. So those lasers have at best the same amount of potency Kizaru has, but reasonably should be less. Then Bonnie went through the same exact barrier. So unless you think that it's like a situation where Luffy only has 2 times the durability of Bonnie and Bonnie could survive it while remaining cognizant the entire time going through, it really just doesn't pan out the way you think it does. him coming back through it a second time shouldn't do this significant of an amount of damage to where he thinks he's almost gonna die, etc., etc., when Bonnie has gone through the same 100% barrier. This doesn't line up logically. It's obviously from the totality of the situation, if anything, and honestly I think Luffy's hyperbolizing the situation anyway. I don't think he really was almost gonna die. That notion is just weird. But then this is the first time you see that Kizaru clearly understands what Gear 5 is. He's like, oh, so this is the thing you do. We don't really understand why he has this knowledge. It could be from the backstory when he's talking about it and hearing about it from Kuma when he does the Nika dance. Could just be that the elders let him know as they were on their way. That being said, in 1093 we see that Luffy, who has Kizaru grabbed, tries spinning him around, and here's where you see that Kizaru still remains extremely calm, still has his usual dialect as highlighted by Sandman AP. He gets spun around and thrown into the ocean essentially. Luffy tries throwing him off the map into the ocean, and he keeps on laughing. Luffy, of course, is stated to get stronger as he laughs regardless. Kizaru then waits until the very last second with his arms crossed, arms folded, completely nonchalant, till he's a literal foot away from the water to turn it back around, come back up with Sacred Jewel, which Sacred Jewel, it doesn't work as an attack in this facet. He just turns it into his light clones. So then when he turns it back into his light clones, he gets back up there in an instant. Luffy is surprised, and all these clones start going after Luffy. At this point, very important to highlight, Luffy has 000 idea where the actual body of Kizaru is. He actually thinks that he might be among these clones, so he can't even differentiate who Kizaru actually is. With that said, one of the clones pulls out his sword and is able to draw blood from Luffy, landing the first attack, and he was the first one to attack Luffy anyway. Understand that clones that don't even scale to Kizaru's actual power are able to damage Luffy, so we understand that it should be obvious at this point anyway from the other situation, Kizaru can easily damage Luffy. With this said, Luffy then gets chased by the clones, and it actually seems that Luffy is similar in speed to these guys, but he basically baits them into a trick because they seem pretty simple-minded. He ends up hitting Dawn Whip, and then they don't really have any durability. He just kicks through the light, and he thinks, oh, did I get the real one? And has no idea that the real Kizaru is right below him, choking out his boy Usopp. This is another example of a prime period where Kizaru could literally just inflict massive amounts of damage to Luffy if he had any inkling of wanting to hurt or defeat or kill Luffy in any kind of way. When Luffy has no idea where he's at and is literally occupied by his clones, and he doesn't even sense the man that's right below him, Kizaru can easily go up there himself with his own sword and cut through Luffy. It's just as easy. Or he could shoot beams from below, anything he wanted to do. Any kind of attack. He could have launched up into the sky and done his acceleration kick with an off-guard Luffy this time. And even imagine if he does his acceleration with his sword. He comes down accelerating and stabs through Luffy. What do you think happens there? Obviously these are hypotheticals, but it really reinforces the point that Kizaru has no intent to kill Luffy, and his mission is simply all that he's there for, while being conflicted and while not actively even really wanting to do this. Unclear justice is very prominent within this one. So at this point, when Luffy figures out where he is, Kizaru then gets up onto the ledge before Luffy could get down to him and shoots off another beam. When he shoots this beam, Luffy does intercept the beam, and we see that Luffy eats the beam and says that it burned him on the inside. So we know that the light beams inherently just burn him. We cut away again, and the Vegatank continues moseying on along, and we get another period of time where they're fighting off screen, where it's just a hot pursuit chase, where Kizaru keeps going after the Vegatank, Luffy keeps going after him, etc., etc., etc. Now, Kizaru, again, I think that within his character, it's pretty simple. We've seen this time and time again at Marineford, Sabaody, where he's held back all these other times just because his lazy nature. He's stated to be slow, very slow to take action, but especially in a situation where he's mentally conflicted. Obviously, Kizaru doesn't need to stand in a spot and then shoot a beam. He could just beam himself over there and finish the job himself. Especially with some of the speed showings we see later, and obviously the acceleration thing. The most optimal course is for him to just beam over there physically and just cut through the fucking tank with his sword or anything, and there's nobody that's going to stop that. With that being the case, we understand that this is the common thread. Kizaru shoots a beam, Luffy blocks it, he's like, oh fuck, I guess fate has saved him. We then cut to the biggest point of strife at the moment, which is the 1094 interaction, which concludes with the White Star gun and all of this. Now, the big things to note at the beginning of this is I mentioned that this was an all-screen fight that took place for a period of time that was pretty significant based on the dialect and the way that these characters are huffing and puffing. We understand that they were fighting, and we see that Kizaru is able to block all Gear 5's attacks when he's on guard. Luffy is using something which seems like some kind of Gatling attack. You obviously can't see the specifics of it, but he's throwing multiple attacks at once, very similar to the interaction with Gear 4 that I showed earlier, and Kizaru blocks all these attacks with relative ease. He then says, listen, sorry, I can't keep playing around, I can't keep spending all my time with you. If I do, I can't fulfill my mission. And Luffy says, yes, but that's my mission. Wheeze wheeze, you had the huff huff from Kizaru. At this point, Kizaru basically gave him a heads up that he is going to dip away again, and yet we see another clear indication that Kizaru is massively faster than Gear 5, blitzes away from Gear 5, and Luffy is left in the dust. Even with the heads up that he was going to leave, there was no means of stopping it, and he cannot contend with Kizaru's speed when he actually applies himself. With this being said, we get to the point where everybody kind of took notice of Saturn showing up. Then Kizaru gets ready to shoot another beam at the Vegapunk, and instead of just going after it physically, again, he waits up in the sky and shoots a beam. Now, this miss is very suspect considering we've seen Kizaru shoot a key point blank with pristine accuracy at Marineford out of somebody's hand from a pretty far ranging distance, and yet he misses a giant Vegapunk. It's very, very weird and suspect, but that's kind of the trope that we see going on. With that being said, Luffy finally catches up to Kizaru after he's in a stationary state, and he comes over here, and Kizaru says something very interesting. You must be reaching your limit right now, calling back to how long that they were fighting, what he had seen from Luffy, and it just talks about like that fight was really a strenuous thing that was happening where Luffy was clearly putting a ton of effort in on the outside. That being said, Kizaru doesn't seem very flustered with it, doesn't really seem like it's really a threat to him, just that it's more so a nuisance. There you see the you must be reaching your limit by now. He then casually turns around and shoots a light beam at Luffy. Now people have been thinking that Luffy had dodged this beam. He did not. It actually makes contact with him, and you see the whack impact frame. Now the reason that it making contact is very important here, because when it makes contact, it hits Luffy in his shoulder when he was already weight imbalanced by loading up the muscle arm, and he was off balance. So when he's off kilter, he essentially goes into this uncontrolled tailspin, which is amplified by the beam that just hit him in the perfect spot on his shoulder to rapidly force this spin. You can clearly tell that Luffy is not in control when he goes into this spin, as he starts screaming out and has the funny expression. At that point, this is a credit to Luffy here. Great moment for Luffy where he uses his battle IQ, uses his goofy nature to his advantage, and uncorks the White Star gun mid tailspin. Something that Kizaru was clearly not expecting, as you see the visible and question mark. So you understand that Kizaru, for one, thinks that Luffy should be out of his form, should be reaching his limit, and then he's seen the bounds of what Luffy can do and is already shown to be able to react and outspeed Gear 5 Luffy. You then see that when he lands an attack on Luffy, he sees a guy that's literally in an uncontrolled tailspin and drops his guard. Now you may call that a fucking skill issue on Kizaru's part for dropping his guard, but it's just what happens. It's the way it was written, and that's very much in Kizaru's character to go into things with a lackadaisical state, as he had no issues with Luffy prior to this and really had no reason to really believe that any threat was imminent. Now, people are talking about, what about observation haki? Now, observation haki works very, very differently in One Piece. People think that it's just this passive, all-knowing ability, and yes, it sometimes can be used passively, where you see characters like Sanji wake up when he notices something. You have the Whitebeard instance where it seems like he's groggy and he reacts to Ace, etc., but it does not always work at the same capacity at all times. You see that it's stated numerous times that if you're fatigued, your observation haki is lessened. If you are in distress, your observation haki is weakened. If you are not calm, if you get worked up, etc., all these times where you see that observation haki is not something that's just blanket at this point. You also need to be actively using future set to use it. We see this highlighted with Kaido, who doesn't use it the entirety of Onigashima until he decides he's just going to copy Luffy and use it. So Kizaru feels like, Luffy is not really a big threat, drops his guard. It's the clearest cut surprise attack you're gonna see, and people have a confusion between a distraction. They think the only ways of off guard are to be distracted. That's not the case. It's like the square and the rectangle. Square is always a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. A distraction is always going to make something be off guard, but an off guard does not have to be a distraction. So he wasn't necessarily distracted here, although you can argue that he's, obviously distracted within his mind with the mental nerf, but that's not really the big thing here. It's more so just that he drops his guard because like Luffy just got hit with this beam, he's in a tailspin, and then Luffy uncorked a punch he's not prepared for and he hadn't seen. So then you even see that Kizaru like kind of notices at the last second, but Luffy's kind of close to Kizaru's like baseline speed without amplifying, and there's a relativity of some sort. Any tip in balance to the scales is going to allow for an attack to land, and that's simply what happens here. Luffy had the slight advantage there with the surprise, and he was able to land the attack. It's like if me and you are in a boxing match, I throw punches at you, you react to me, we go back and forth, and then all of a sudden I throw a cross at you, you block it, and then all of a sudden a growth comes out of my forearm, wraps around and hits you. You were looking at me, right? But you're still off guard. So it's very simple like that. He gets hit and he says, I'm seeing stars. Luffy actually legitimately spawned in stars here. We then see them crash land to the ground, and we get some very interesting dialogue from Saturn, where Saturn says, This is rather sluggish work by your standards, Kizaru, and it seems to tell me that there was an assumption, because it didn't seem that Saturn ever wanted to get off the ship. Kizaru was there for his protection, and that it seemed that their whole objective was that, you know, Kizaru was enough to take on Luffy. With that said, Kizaru, this is the big point where everybody that's against Kizaru clings onto. Says, I'm sorry, I've failed you, and I don't think I'll be mobile anytime soon. And Saturn, even then, is not necessarily buying it 100%, but because he's fighting with Luffy, who is a Yonko, he's like, I think I can understand why, and kind of lets it slide, giving Kizaru kind of carte blanche to be like, all right, this is acceptable behavior. You got to use your critical thinking here, especially with all the context we have later. We'll circle back to this in a minute. The big point of emphasis here is that it took everything Luffy had to knock Kizaru down momentarily. There's a direct comparison to when he gets back up from when he's fighting Kaido, where he tells Kaido verbatim he's not at his limit, and then when he punches Kizaru and he says, yes, I'm at my limit, and he literally is, because we see that he cannot move a muscle and his durability literally went down to 0. He needed Frankie to protect him from Saturn's attack, and when Frankie protected him, he punched him with a non-haki coded, because Frankie doesn't even have haki, punch, where Luffy is supposed to be impervious to blunt force damage and physical damage, yet he spits up blood very clearly, takes internal wounds from Frankie's punch. With that said, you understand that at that point, Luffy is completely tapped, and Kizaru, who gets up seconds after this, which we will get into, literally won this interaction at this point. If nobody is able to heal Luffy and get him the food that he needs to be able to move, as he literally cannot move a muscle, and with durability literally at the depths of hell, Kizaru, who can shoot beams out of anywhere in his body, doesn't even need to have gotten back up. He can just simply sit up and shoot beams, but he can get back up, which is very easy to understand right after, and just go over there and stab Luffy till he finishes. So if they're in a barren wasteland, even with all the context we have beforehand, with the mental nerf, with the not actively trying to fight Luffy, all this and that, Kizaru would still have won this interaction on a barren wasteland, even without fighting him serious, even with all that. So that's why it seems very clear cut to me that Kizaru is still very clearly above Luffy whilst holding back. Now, we're going to get into the rest of this thing. Now, the point people are going to say, oh, bro, what do you mean seconds later? He's down for chapters, 15, 20 chapters he's down. Guys, out of these chapters that he's down, from chapter 1095 to fucking 1103, the 9 chapters that he's down, so to speak, are literally all backstory chapters. Literally all backstory where nothing takes place in the story. He comes down, and then when we cut back in 1103, what ends up happening is it's very easy to understand that Kizaru, when he's sitting up, and first off, he doesn't even think of Luffy when he was on the ground. He was in the same spot, and he thinks of Sentomaru and Bonnie, highlighting again that he's conflicted and thinking about those guys. Then you see that Luffy got his food, which we still have no idea who gave him the food, and Kizaru's weirdly and mysteriously in a different spot. I don't know who gave him food, though, so I'm not going to make any claims. We see that Kizaru sits there. At this point, he's literally just like, fine. He's fine. Like, he's literally fine, and he's just watching and observing things take place. His face looks scot-free clean right after the fact. It's like, what the fuck? And he didn't even think about the damage. At this point, I'm wondering, for one, I think that obviously, like, when something like that hits you, it was kind of like a flashbang anyway. He might have been blinded by the fucking stars. Obviously, I'm sure it did affect him in some way. I don't want to be fucking disingenuous. I think Luffy can damage him. He used an advanced Conqueror's attack, but it's very minimal, to a point where Kizaru is not like in any way close to losing or anything like this. He just takes this and kind of takes it in stride and doesn't even acknowledge it. He then sits back up, right? And we see this whole interaction play out with Kuma, where Kizaru is very clearly watching this all play out, especially highlighted in the backstory that he's friends with Kuma, Bonnie, Vegapunk, Sentomaru, all these people. So he watches this play out. He watches Kuma uncork this giant punch. And then the first thing you see is Kizaru says, damn, it's over. And he grabs his head and he's like, fuck. Like, I now am gonna have to probably put down all these people potentially. Like, I have to get back up now. Saturn's been hit. This is just super unfortunate. He's literally just watching it take place. So at this point, because I was like, fuck, I better get my ass up. So he gets up and he goes over to start fight. Again, doesn't go after Luffy here. Doesn't go after Luffy here. Even after Luffy started, he's still on the ground feasting. He's still in a very vulnerable state, not up. And we see that Kizaru doesn't even think of Luffy. There's no fucking cause to think of the guy. He doesn't care. He just goes over there, like fucking stands in front of Vegapunk. He kicked Frankie out of the way. He went over there and stood next to him, and then he has more mental confliction moments where Vegapunk is fucking talking like, oh, what kind of man are you, blah 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 blah. So guys, it is so simple to understand that this was never the intention of Kizaru. This arc isn't even meant for Kizaru to get crazy feats. It's literally like Sanji and WCI, where it's a character arc. Kizaru is on a crazy character arc right now, where we are seeing that this guy is going through the worst day of his life from a mental standpoint. He is conflicted. We're seeing unclear justice play out right in front of our eyes. It's meant to be this tragedy. That's the point. So anyway, we continue on. Luffy finally gets back up. Kizaru's going to kill Bonnie and Kuma with, a special Japanese phrase where he says it's going to be painless, obviously conflicted again. And Luffy off guards him with another punch that Kizaru just gets back up from again. So he eats that punch. He then stands in front of Luffy. And mind you, this is after Luffy got fully healed, fully recovered. Kizaru got no help to get back up. Kizaru doesn't have an awaken zone. Kizaru doesn't have a food amp. He doesn't have any of this shit. And he's already essentially won. Luffy gets back up at full power. He takes another attack. He then fucking comes over, gets back up again, stands in front of Luffy and makes a claim. At this rate, they're going to expect me to take all your heads. Again, reinforcing the fact that Kizaru was expected to win here, regardless of the opposition. So when he says that, we basically see that he kills Vegapunk right in front of Luffy. So a whole Yonko crew couldn't protect one old man from Kizaru, who wasn't even actively trying to fight them or actively fully committed to the kill. And you see that he goes like in the most distressed moment ever. After killing Vegapunk, they put emphasis on his dark sunglasses, where he had said before he wanted the darker sunglasses. After killing Vegapunk, he literally stands there, doesn't move, lets Sanji run by him, pick up Vegapunk again after kicking Sanji. So we already know he's way faster than Sanji. So if he wants to stop Sanji there, he could. So he's hesitating already. We got the wavering makes you weak fucking statement from Garp. We have the fucking Enies Lobby instance where Luffy was conflicted about fucking helping Robin, whether she wanted to help, and it's shown that they get stronger. You have to never doubt that's power from Rayleigh. You have numerous times the Gonfall statement, you're at your weakest when you doubt, to never doubt that is power, etc., etc. Like, it's hammered over your fucking head. So you got that. He then fucking is like, all right, fuck it, I'm gonna have to give chase. I don't know if he's dead or not. So he fucking starts moving toward getting after Sanji, and Luffy grabs him again off guard. So every single instance that Luffy has landed an attack or done anything like grab, it's all been off guard. So there's no actual feats for Luffy in this fight. And people think like, oh, he turned him into a pancake, bro. Like, guys, that's Luffy's ability, guys. He turned Kaido into a fucking jump rope. That's what you're gonna see going forward in these fights. He's a goofy character, and that's his ability. It's like a Kainu burning somebody. He has magma. What the fuck is supposed to happen? When an attack lands, there's going to be tune effects in this form. Just what happens. So Kizaru was already grabbed. There was never a 2v1. He's in his hand. There's no fight that takes place. Luffy doesn't react to Kizaru physically attacking him. He dodges some beams that Sentomaru can dodge. They're not impressive. He does the pancake thing. He throws Kizaru over to the fucking ship. And that's essentially the end of what we're seeing. But then when you see him on the ship, you see that Sandman AP's come out and said this, and it should be very fucking clear that he's down from mental confliction. He's down from mental wounds. The deep wound he's referencing is traumatic responses to the situation of killing his homie, fighting all his friends, and just the distress of the situation, which should be very clear. And you got people going over this, oh, why are there medics nearby then? The medics are telling you that they don't see any wounds. They're saying, show us your wounds. Where are the wounds? Why are you down? And Kizaru's like, am I wounded? Deeply wounded. Like, can't get more cookie cutter than this. People want to say like, oh, what if Kizaru died if there was no battleship? Like, it's the dumbest shit ever. For one, you've already seen him get thrown before, and he reacts at the very last second. It's just in his nature to take action at the very slowest. He literally reacted at the last second, right before he was about to go into the water, before he came back up the last time. This time, he fucking lands in the ship before that even can occur. And then he's on the ship, and he's not in a position where he cannot fight. He's in a position where he does not want to fight anymore. And he's already just been like, fuck it, just let me rest. He's accomplished his mission, and there's really no reason for him to do that. The Gorosei's already there at that point. I'm sure he obviously senses that they're there. Now, I do think there's going to be something else coming. That's why I delayed making it, because I don't think that this story's wrapped up. I think there's going to be more to happen at the end, because the character arc is Kizaru's character arc for this arc. So I don't know what that's going to be, but we have a 3-week break, so I want to get this video out. I think I covered everything, but I'm sure there'll be somebody nitpicking something. It's really just this simple, guys. Luffy was already scaling below Kizaru from the events before this, but I'm not going to get into all the scaling beforehand. You can go check out my fucking Kizaru scale on this page if you want to go see the events prior to Egghead, why he scales above Kaido, who scales above Luffy. With that said, the events in Egghead, nothing to change that, and it's very clear cut that the whole purpose of this arc, even highlighted by Oda himself, when he comes out in his fucking handwritten letters, like, are people really understanding the relationships in this arc, and puts it in a color-coded fucking ordinance that anybody could understand, that it's about the relationships. It's about the storyline. It's not about Kizaru bawling out and just having an ego moment where he's like, I'm gonna beat a Yonko, I'm gonna take a Yonko's head. That was never the plan. He's not even the character to be in this arc for that to happen. Oda keeps protecting the admirals at every turn, always holds them back, and this is another instance of that happening to a T. He did something similar with Aokiji, even though Aokiji still handled business. Kizaru still accomplished his mission while not actually trying to fight Luffy, and clearly showed, in my opinion, that he is still stronger than Luffy. Will win a one-on-one fight if they were in a death battle. But that's my take. I'm sure a lot will disagree. I know it's a long video, but if you made it this far, I appreciate it. To all my subscribers, supporters, and yeah, spread this around. Put a hell of time into it. Peace.